Hello, Ollie, and thank you for doing this. I just wonder if, first off, you could just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your consort, the Apex Singers.
Yeah, I'm Ollie. I studied composition at RNCM and set up the Apex Singers in my last year there. A group of 8 wonderful singers, and I write all the music for those singers, made up of ex-RNCM and Uni of music students. And the consort was kind of initially set up around the idea of I wanted to create a group where I could write music specifically for the singers in that group, rather than writing sort of generic SATB things where it's just like you're writing for the traditional ranges of each voice part. And I just wanted to get a group of singers together that I could write specifically for them. And then it grew from there, and we've been doing it since graduating. And yeah, and now we're on to making our second album, which is really exciting.
Um, and so you set it up in your fourth year in college. Was that a project within college or something you did on your own back?
Yeah, it was sort of a combination actually. So I knew that I wanted to set it up from, I think, probably the very start of my degree. I knew that it was what I was going to want to end RNCM on setting up and doing as part of my career. Fourth year at college is very much set up and designed to sort of push you towards starting a career. You know, that's the joy of having that fourth year. And they run the creative project module, and so I was able to tie setting up the Apex Singers and running projects with them into my creative project module, and launch off the back of that. But it was very much something that I'd wanted to do since the very beginning of my degree. You know, I'd always wanted to set up a group like the Apex Singers.
And so when you set up Apex and you auditioned out and you got your singers, did you have a very clear sense of what Apex was going to sound like, the kind of music you were going to do, or was that something that was still evolving as you were starting together?
Yeah, absolutely not. Like it fully evolved as we were doing it. The concept is something that I wanted to do from the start. You know, set up a group where I could just really intently get to know each individual voice that I was writing for. But the in terms of the sound world, that was always going to come out of, I guess, who auditioned for the group and my writing style to a certain extent. I'd done some consort and a cappella writing in the past, and certainly when we initially set up the ensemble, we spent like the first year of being a group, we would spend 3-4 hour rehearsals not actually singing any repertoire. We would just do exercises. We do what we call like play singing games, which are almost like group warm-up exercises, but we try and make them a bit more fun. So things like, you know, you're like standing opposite ends of the studio to each other and like trying to match vowel shapes and things like that. And I think a lot of what our sound world ended up being came from that experimentation of just who do we have in the room who is doing this with us, what do they sound like together, what can they try and sound like together, you know, different combinations. That's the joy of like one part singing, is you combine like 2 or 3 people and they make that sound. You combine another 2 or 3 people and they make that sound. And the, you know, with 8 voices especially, there's just endless combinations of what that can be. And so to fully explore that, yeah, that took literally like a full year of just like, I would bring arrangements in, but they'd be like drafts of arrangements. I never bring anything finished in. We'd like workshop them to a certain extent. We do group exercises. And to that end, I guess the parting glass, which was one of the first arrangements we ever did, stemmed from a workshop where we were doing these sort of group exercises, and we were practicing like cascading arpeggios around the group and seeing how well can we get that to blend, or how well can we actively not get that to blend, and how does that sound, and can we like bring out different notes and different registers, etc. And as a result, we ended up doing that in the arrangement, and the arrangement ended up just happening because we had explored all these different sounds in rehearsal room and put them together with this, you know, traditional folk song, the parting glass, very well known, to create that arrangement. So that was very much like the initial process of start making the group was very, I guess, experimental in that sense. And there was no thought ideas as to what the sound world would be. It came out of who the singers were in the room, you know.
So that's really interesting to hear about that sort of first year and just having time to sort of explore that stuff. Were there any, without naming names or things, I know lots of the members of Apex and they're wonderful people, but they weren't necessarily all really experienced consort singers. So A, were there any sort of challenges in doing those kind of exercises? And B, how did you overcome that as a group?
Yeah, 100%. It completely varied in ability. Good, it's a good point to bring up. And when we were auditioning, I should say, when I was holding the auditions for it, that was like completely not a requirement at all. I wasn't really listening for people's musicality as much as their like willingness to be involved in something like this, and their voices as well, and just like how I guess, for want of a better word, how malleable and how like up for it, for playing around with what the sound would be. Yeah, it did present challenges. When we first started, we had people who were classically chorally trained, we had people who were on the opera course, we had people who had never done any group singing before, and were just doing like solo folk jazz stuff. We had all sorts. And yeah, I think that none of that mattered because it doesn't really play a part in what we were creating, because we were creating something from scratch. You know, it's a group of people who had never sung before coming together to create sound together at its purest form. So the different styles of like training and previous experience didn't really come into play. And even like to this day, when you talk about like musicality, for example, like whenever we hold Apex Singers auditions now, you don't have to do any sight reading in the audition. It's not necessary, because you know, people can learn arrangements in their own time, have by ear, they can use MIDI tracks or whatever. So it's really isn't a hurdle, if that makes sense. But I think it's such a there's this idea that you have to have certain training to do certain things, but when you're creating something from scratch, it doesn't matter, you know, because it is just about sound that people make together.
And I think what's interesting about that is that you're sort of changing in some ways what the criteria are. So perhaps historically, where it might be your sight reading ability or your ability to have experience in a certain area, you're putting the onus on people's malleability, their ability to find new things.
Yeah, and their versatility and willingness to throw themselves into the idea of just of exploring the sound world together, if you know what I mean. Yeah, absolutely.
So I realise we're talking about Apex, and you know the group well. I've heard the group many times, but for someone who hasn't heard Apex before, the sound that they make as a group, you did eventually land on, how do you describe the kind of, in inverted commas, Apex sound, or the type of genre of where you've landed?
Yeah, that's a really hard question. I've been asked this many times. There's no easy way of answering this. We do a lot of folk inspired music, and the sound world we've created, I think, is a combination, at its purest form, is a combination of my writing style at the time of setting up the group, and the voices that I have at my disposal, I guess, because of this whole concept of trying to write specifically for the singers in that group. And we do a lot of folk music, and like to take the creative cap on and put the business cap on for a second, they're out of copyright and there's an audience already there for traditional music, and there's something about taking music and tunes and stories that already exist and kind of like trying to breathe new life into them and create and present them in a different way that's always really fascinated me in arranging in general. And so I think that the kinds of songs that we did originally for Hiraeth, the first album, which was folk songs from around the world, very kind of like pushed us down that folk inspired path. Yeah, does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. I think potentially one of the other things to add is that you produce a
Yes.
lot of the stuff, especially lots of recordings you did through lockdown. And I know I know talking to you when you were first setting up the group, you sort of had an idea about that. You sing on mic as a group.
Yes, you're right. You're right to mention all that. I should have brought that. Yes, we do. We we sing individually mic'd up, and again, this kind of it all does link back to the fact that I'm a composer and arranger who set up a group, as opposed to a singer vocalist who's setting up a group to sing in, I suppose. And part of the whole close miking thing, as you probably know, because I know you've done some work with these kind of groups before, but it just adds a whole extra palette to what you can write. So for example, our bass singer can be EQ'd and balanced so that he can sing at the complete extremities of his range, and it doesn't matter, the problems you would get in an acoustic setting go out the window because we're mic'd up. Or for example, you could have your tenor sing like a big forte high passage and a nice low, like really intimate alto solo, and you can do that because you're mic'd up, and you can make that tenor sound really distant, but you can bring that alto up. So again, like the miking kind of sound world does play into the kind of stuff we create. And now, like when we do recordings, it's always quite well produced because that's how we get that side of it. But it does stem from wanting to increase that palette of what I can write, what I can do, what I can create for the voices. We're not limited by what works acoustically in a room. Yeah. That makes sense.
Yeah, and it's an interesting way to phrase it, in the sense that I suppose it takes away some of the challenges, and I suppose it'd be interesting how that affects, you think, the rehearsal process. But you also, one thing that becomes very clear when you listen to like your first album is that sort of depth of bass and the real height of your sopranos, that you can create this big wash of sound that's quite,
and even with one voice on each part. Yeah.
So when you are rehearsing that, and we're so used to rehearsing to our ears in space, how do you balance that kind of process of, and when you also when you sing this stuff live, which you do very often, do you find that you have to practice for that way of being close mic'd, or do you sort of rehearse one way and then apply slightly different skills, do you think, when it comes to the close mic?
It's a bit of both. We do a lot more rehearsing on mic, just because of where we're at. We have our own equipment. It's much easier to do. When we first started, obviously we didn't have a huge budget or anything. This was just created at college. We weren't doing on mic rehearsals, and there was a lot of I guess the thing you can really work on as a group is balance. And actually, you'd think that close miking negates the need for that because you have a person mixing at the back. That's not what the person's doing. The sound engineer at the back of the room, who's doing all the twiddly things on the mixing desk, can't make up for an unbalanced sound from a group, if you see what I mean, fundamentally. And so a lot of our process now, yes, we get used to rehearsing with in-ears. We have to get down the technical side of things. We have in-ears that feed back live mixes to the singers so that they can hear the correct balance of what they need. So if in a certain song this singer needs less of the soloist but more of the bass singer, then that's what they need. But we also do perform acoustically from time to time as well, and there's trying to have versatility within our arrangements, so that the stuff that is primarily written to work mic'd up, we can still perform acoustically. And we've been exploring it a lot recently. And we've been really delving into the whole idea of balance dynamics in a consort, and how if you take a group of singers, everyone's dynamic range at different parts of their tessitura is going to be different. So if you have a group of singers singing X chord, and your bass is here in their voice, and your soprano is here in their voice, and your alto is there, etc., they're all going to have a different point of scale for what forte is, for example. And if they all sang forte, that's not going to be balanced. And for the group to sound forte, it might be that the soprano actually has to sing MP, their MP, the bass has to sing their fortissimo, etc., to actually create a group forte. And then once you've found that balance, dynamic balance as a group, you then have to find what the group's limitations are, so that in context of your arrangement, you can find where that forte is. So it's a whole world of stuff that takes a huge amount of practice to master acoustically, but actually the miking doesn't negate the need for that, because like I said, we can't fix an unbalanced sound live. And fundamentally, that is just part of consort singing, and it's an essential part of trusting your ear over your voice, essentially. That's what I say to our singers. You got to trust what you're hearing in the room, because that's what everyone else is going to hear.
Well, yeah, a mic can only amplify what's being created by it.
Exactly,
so it's not tuning it for you. I'm interested in going back towards, so talking about earlier, which is your arranging hat. You do lots of hats for this ensemble, but I know you're a very experienced arranger and doing lots of things. I'm sure, as you found with Apex, sometimes, although this ensemble is based upon you being a composer and arranger, it's also sometimes just essential to find that you need to find an arrangement or rearrange something to fit your ensemble. And I just wanted to know if you had any kind of key tips of how you go about looking at taking, for instance, a song like a folk song and adapting it for your group specifically, or just generally for voices that within a consort.
Yes, really interesting question. It's the further down the line we get, it's interestingly that Apex sort of gets more and more of it a different treatment to other things, interestingly, just as their sound develops. But generally speaking, for any commission, regardless of what it is, I will always try and get to know the musicians I'm writing for. So if I'm doing a choral commission for a particular choir, I will try and sit in on a rehearsal, or I'll listen to their catalogue online if I can, to get to know what the voices are I'm writing for. In terms of specifically Apex, for a second, arranging for them, I was having a conversation with John from the Swingles, who is arranger for the Swingles, is a tenor, and he told me something that stuck with me many years ago. But he said anything can be arranged for only voices. Like anything can be made to work for only voices. It's just that some things will feel easier in the process than others, and some things will have an easier sort of process, as it were. And it's kind of resonated with me because most of our most popular arrangements with Apex have been the ones I've written in like an afternoon. And the ones that I like labor over weeks like just don't hit as well, interestingly. And I think it does a huge part of the process for me in terms of arranging specifically is about that initial, what song are we going to do that works for us? Because if the song's right, then I'll probably write it really quickly, and that's how we know we're on to like a winner of an arrangement, if that makes sense. It's not quite as simple as that. I'm sort of washing it down. There are other factors, obviously, number of parts, length of song, etc. But I think it does, like, it really just hammers home the importance of song choice. It's not all about the notes on the page. It's about that very initial like sourcing of material. Arranging for voices with Apex music, I will listen to a song that we're planning to do, and usually immediately I'll be able to hear who the soloists are going to be. And that's a really easy starting point for me, because then I find especially nowadays anyway, the arrangement tends to blossom from there. If I can hear, because it's part of the joy of writing for a group where I know all the singers' voices so minutely well that I can listen to a song and I can like immediately put a singer's voice onto the tune and hear what that sounds like in my head. And then it kind of follows from there. It's very much like I hear it and I write it down kind of thing. I could get more technical if you want me to, but we would probably be here for quite a while.
Well, no, I know it's a huge thing as it goes. What I'm interested in is sort of the, without going into the compositional process of taking the ranges of people, with your guys, when you're thinking about putting the music around that melody as it goes and taking the voices, do you aside from just voice leading going through, do you have things that you have as a setup that you tend to go, right, well, I'm gonna start from Elliot as your bass, or do you go, well, actually I think I know a lot of your arrangements don't use all 8 singers, for example. Do you sort of have that stuff when you start, or does that appear as it goes through the process?
Yeah, the interesting point about the 8 singers thing. We don't have all our arrangements as 8 singers, and that's because I'm very much of the mindset that if it doesn't need 8 parts, it shouldn't have 8 parts. I'm not going to write unnecessary parts into a piece because it's probably not going to add anything. So all our 8-part arrangements that we do have in our catalogue, there will always be a reason for it, and it'll always be something that I've like. From a lot of them, I've tried and I can't write it for less parts. Like I give myself the challenge of, can I actually make this work with 7 or 6 parts? And if I can't, then it feels like, right, this is good. This should be 8 parts. In terms of like, without getting too compositional, the actual like tropes and things that happen in Apex music, again, I try not to like have a particular like, oh, this melody goes this way, so we're going to use this chord and this chord and this chord because that's what Apex sounds like. Yeah, I try not to get too technical with it because it can get bogged down and become a bit too clinical. And I think that's how we keep interest within our music. I trust at this stage that my ear and my knowledge of the group means that what I'm writing for that group of singers is going to be the Apex Singer sound world. And yes, if you sit down, I've sat down with people before and done some analysis of Apex arrangements with them. And if you do like sit down and analyze, there are things, that crop up in different arrangements. Like there's particular voicings that work really well with our group. There's particular, the other one is there's particular combinations of voices that pop up a lot. Like it might be that Matthew and Lydia often duet on the tune, or it might be that if Elliot's singing a low bass solo, then these people will accompany it because it works well, like tonally, with where it sits in his voice. But again, like it's not like I have a folder with these things written down in. I try and make sure that it's all very natural and it's happening instinctively from piece to piece. Again, because I don't want it to get too clinical. And I think that's how we include variety in our music and it doesn't become too samey, is by adapting to what works for each song, basically, and not recycling arrangements.
And especially early on in the process, how much did stuff get recomposed once you had sort of started work, once you had brought it to the group and tried things out?
Yeah, interestingly, I'd say that things get recomposed more now than they used to, but I think that's partly because we've got more comfortable with it as a group. When we first started, like I said, at the very beginning, there weren't actually that many arrangements. Like when we first started, there were no arrangements. And then we did workshops, we did rehearsals. I started to bring in arrangements, trickle them into rehearsals, and we'd work on them and things would get moved around. I think the passing class is a good example of that one, where did just kind of like happen in a rehearsal. Now we've got, I think especially because we did this isolation series over the pandemic where we were recording parts individually, and they would send me their parts and I'd stick them together, make the classic split screen videos kind of thing, and produce them at home. That process wasn't very conducive to adapting rehearsals, because we were also on a time limit, and because of the communication block, it would be very much, I write a score, I send the score out to singers, they record their parts, not really knowing what that's going to sound like in context of the music, and then send them back to me. And then I send them the finished arrangement, and they're suddenly like, oh, I had the tune in bar 3. I had no idea, you know, that kind of thing. But while that has its cons, we've come out of it like having such a larger appreciation for what you gain being able to not just like sing together in a room, be able to like create together in a room. And I think it's given a lot of our singers more confidence to like bring stuff up in rehearsal, you know, if something doesn't quite sit right, or if something needs changing. There isn't very much like structurally that changes to arrangements. It is often like, I'll write the arrangement, send it out, they learn the parts, we come together, we sing it as a group. But it's still like the group know the sound as well as I do at this stage, so it can become a collaborative process in that way. And I think it's important from like a singer's perspective not to get locked into what's on the page, because you got to remember everyone's voice is completely different. It's not like two pianists playing a duet, they're playing the same instrument. If you have a group of singers, everyone's playing their own instrument, and everyone's instrument's going to be very, very different, because everyone's voices sound completely different. That's what's drawn me to singing initially in the first place. And so I don't think singers should be afraid about adapting arrangements to work for them, or even writing their own arrangements, because who knows your voice is better than you, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose as you guys are testament to is how actually writing for a group can help create all of those things that you're looking to rehearse. You're not trying to find the music in somebody else's preset music. You're creating music from within the ensemble. I'm interested to move on to what it's like actually. You say you formed in RNCM, and then this was always something that you wanted to do. A few years on from that, some of what the realities are of being an up-and-coming consort that is looking to try and, I don't know whether it's right to say break into the industry, but trying to work as a professional consort actually in the UK scene of that. So what's it like?
The honest answer, no, it's a huge amount of time, and I think the thing that maybe I hadn't realized at the time when I was at RNCM doing this is that nothing changes overnight when college ends. You know, when you graduate, it happens super fast. Like, it does all grow. And yes, we started this in my last year at RNCM, and yes, we've been doing it for like another 3 years after that, but the growth has been gradual, like consistently, like gradual throughout our time of doing this. And I think in terms of like the now, we're in a very, very unique situation where we're coming out of a pandemic. So it's hard to say what it would have been like had the pandemic not happened. But we are very much sort of, like I said with the isolation series, we've got this newfound love of making music together in the same room. Not that we didn't have that before, but I guess we've got more of an appreciation of that now. And our focus is certainly starting to shift more towards live concerts and live making music together and putting on shows over the recorded stuff. I think that's partly because, to a certain extent, without seeing our horn, we've kind of cracked the recording element. and we want to bring our live performing to the same standard, as it were. And I think having had the pandemic and not being able to perform live, but being able to record music together throughout that time, means that one has kind of like gone up over the other, if that makes sense. In terms of like the technical aspects of actually running a group like this, like professionally, they all have other jobs. Is something to bear in mind. Like everyone has to earn a living, and so there's a lot of like schedule juggling and things like that. But the thing that keeps it all going and keeps it grounded is the fact that we're all doing this first and foremost as a passion project, because we love to do it, and we started doing it because we love to do it. There, you know, it wasn't like people applied because they needed a job and a salary or anything like that. And that ethos has stayed with the group and stays with the group every time we audition people, even though, you know, we're now a professional ensemble. We do everything's paid for, and we do professional gigs, and we're working all the time. The ethos is still there, that we're doing this because we believe in what we're creating and we love doing it. And I think that's the important thing. Like trying to take anything professional, is that has to stay through what you're doing.
And I think you absolutely, and I think as well, the last couple of years and all the things that you can never predict are always going to happen, which is true of any time. Bring that front and center as it goes through. You said it earlier, you joked about sort of taking off your composer hat and putting on the business hat of it. Do you think that as the years have gone by, do you think that there have been things that you've had to adapt to or move with from a business point of view, from a branding point of view, because you've gone, I think there's something in this, or this is what people seem to like us doing? Or how much have you found has been driven, do you think, from yourself or as the group, and how much has come from feeling your way through this world and adapting to it?
Yeah, I think a bit of both. I'm very much like, I actually really love the business side of running a group like this, and I love the managerial side, like the non-creative side as well as the creative side. And that's always really interested me, which I guess is handy, you know, trying to, because for a lot of people it's either or, I guess. And yeah, in terms of my writing, one of the, and I know there are people who have the complete opposite view, and that's just a show to how music is so subjective. But one of the things that I really, for want of a better word, judge my music by is how much other people like it. Obviously, first and foremost, I have to like it to write it, but it's a testament for me as to whether what I'm creating is fulfilling, is how well it's received by others, especially by people I don't know. You know, it's always nice when we get like comments and messages from people who none of us have any idea who they are, and that's always going to be the case, isn't it? And I think to a certain extent, even if it's subconsciously, yeah, that probably does drive what we do, and what we create. And we are trying to, like, we are making this a living, and that you've got to remember that in order to do that, there are certain things and certain easier paths to take. You know, yeah. There's not much else to add to that, other than I don't ever like let it affect the creative output, in the sense that it is very much two caps. I don't really wear them at the same time, but one can drive the other. I suppose that's probably the best way to put it, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
Perfect.
And no, great. And actually, sort of my last kind of area I wanted to talk about is that at the moment you are in the process, I think you said earlier, of looking to record your second album. And as we've described already, Apex has found themselves in, you've very much developed a sound kind of world that you live in, and because of partly things like practical reasons like copyright and things. You do a lot of received music, and you've become very popular within an area of doing that. As you look to make the always the like influential second album after the first success, I just wonder about how you think about crafting those kind of things, albums, concerts, how you think about putting together this music, which is all written by the same composer, is a combination of your singers. How do you go about creating those things so that you feel satisfied that you've got something that is varied and engaging and shows you off to your fullest as a consort?
Well, so to give some context, I guess, with regards to Hiraeth, which was the first album we did, yes, they're all written by the same person, me. They're all sung by the same singers. But one of the joys of doing these folk songs is the stories behind them and the rich histories behind them. And I think when we did Hiraeth, I set out with the challenge of trying to create an album of folk music from around the world. And one of the goals with that was making sure there was a song from every continent, including Antarctica. We actually got a folk song from Antarctica, believe it or not. So that was like one of the goals, tick, 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 tick. And so structurally, there's that concept there. And in terms of how we can present that to an audience in an engaging way, you know, we're 8 individual singers who are singing together. And each singer, when you give them a solo or a duet, or like I said, any kind of combination, creates a completely different sound within that same sound world. It's like sub sound worlds of our own sound world. And even now, like we've got a lot more upbeat repertoire as we've gone through the Isolation series. I wonder why. And so even now, like we have songs that fit in certain categories of our sound world, and we have songs that fit in other categories of our sound world. And whenever we're curating like a live set list or an album or anything together, it's very much about finding a balance within our sound world. I think we're fortunate enough that the way our sound was created, everything we kind of do, because it's written by me and sung by the singers, and we've developed it over a long period of time, is Apex singers. And within that, we've got variety through the different stories, the different songs, the different combinations of singers, the different subgenres within our genre. And it's just about curating something that feels balanced and unrepetitive, I suppose, within that.
And will you sort of mentally go through that whole thing, or even physically with the album? Do you sort of listen to it in different combinations, or do you very much go in going, I know what order, track list, everything's going to go through?
Track list order is an interesting one, because again, there's like the business cap and the creative cap. The business cap is people listen to the first track first, and so you want them to like it. And often people will also skip to the last track, so you always have to think about what's top entailing with the business cap. With the creative cap, yes, I do like to think about how one song links onto the other, and I think that's somewhat more prevalent with live performances, because you have an audience who are sitting through from start to finish. And while some people listen to albums like that, a lot of people don't. A lot of people will dip in and out of albums. With live performances, we break up our songs with compares. And the compares are always actually a lot more thought out than you'd expect. You've been to some of our live shows, and you've seen some of the compares happen. And although there are sometimes they've got more and more comfortable about public speaking as we've gone on. They used to be terrified, and now it gets much easier the more we do it. There's more thought that goes into, right, let's put these 2 songs together, because then the person who's speaking after it can segue from that into that very well through this theme, and that will link us onto that, etc. And I do like to try and think about the through plot. Having said that, that doesn't necessarily mean that that part of the process is being thought of from the writing side of things. I think that's important to note, because I think that would almost put too much of a limitation on what we're creating. And the idea of, I mean, with Hiraeth and with our second album, I didn't sit down and decide what songs were going to be on the album before I started writing them. It's like with Hiraeth, I had the idea of having a folk song from every continent, but I didn't plan what those folk songs were going to be before I started writing the first one. With Straveg, the second album, we've sort of it's happening because it's been so requested, which is lovely. But it's sort of become a compilation album of all the stuff we created over lockdown, some of our favorites that people want to hear recorded together in a room together in a studio. But we've done live shows of that album, and there are always ways to link songs together and to tell the stories in a cohesive way. And there's always a way to do that, no matter what you're performing. And I think some of it does just come down to figuring out what that is.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really interesting. I suppose I just have one kind of pithy question that always gets asked just to finish off, which is the good old advice question. For anyone who is working in a consort, enjoying being in their consort, thinking about how that might continue after their time at RNCM, do you have any key things that you think are great to have in their minds before graduating?
Sorry. It's popular. Yes, I make your own opportunities. Don't wait or apply for other people's. Is a really, really key one that stuck with me. I used to apply for endless composition competitions and grants and all sorts, and I used to look for opportunities to write, and I realized that it was a waste of my time. and I've got to where I am because I do the stuff I want to do, and I create my own opportunities. If I want to, for example, if I want to write an album for a group of singers I've never met before, I did it. You know, as in don't rely on the system, and just try, and if you really want to do something, then you can make it happen without having to rely on Arts Council grants or this competition scheme or this scholarship scheme or getting this degree. Nice and vague, but hopefully that will be helpful for some people.
No, I think that's great advice. Ollie, thank you so much for doing this. I really, really appreciate you taking your time, and it's been so lovely to sort of mine your experience over the last few years with Apex. All the best with the second album.
Thank you.
I will look forward to hearing it.
Cheers.
And I'll stop.